It was a quiet night in the small town of Millville, nestled in the heart of rural America. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But beneath the peaceful surface of this sleepy town, a dark and disturbing secret was brewing. It all began with the disappearance of a young woman named Melissa. She was a popular local waitress, known for her bubbly personality and infectious smile. But on the night of May 25, 2019, she vanished without a trace. At first, the townspeople assumed Melissa had simply run away. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, it became clear that something much more sinister was at play. The police launched an extensive investigation, but despite their best efforts, they could find no trace of Melissa. The case went cold, and it seemed as though the young woman had simply vanished into thin air. But then, 6 months after Melissa's disappearance, a shocking discovery was made. A group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave in a wooded area just outside of town. Inside the grave was Melissa's body, badly decomposed and almost unrecognizable. The news sent shockwaves through the community, and the police immediately launched a renewed investigation. They combed the area around the grave for any clues, and interviewed anyone who may have had information about Melissa's disappearance. As the investigation continued, a suspect emerged, a man named David, who had been seen with Melissa on the night of her disappearance. David was a drifter who had recently arrived in town, and he had a reputation for being volatile and unpredictable. The police brought David in for questioning, and he initially denied any involvement in Melissa's death. But as the hours passed, he began to crack. He confessed to killing Melissa in a fit of rage, and led police to the spot where he had buried her body. David's confession sent shockwaves through the town. No one could understand how someone could commit such a heinous crime, especially against someone as well liked as Melissa. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that David's actions were not as random as they initially appeared. In fact, David had a long history of violent behavior, including several arrests for assault and battery. It also emerged that David had a history with Melissa. They had been in a tumultuous relationship, marked by frequent arguments and violent outbursts. Melissa had tried to break things off with David several times, but he had always convinced her to give him another chance. On the night of Melissa's murder, David had shown up at the restaurant where she worked, demanding to talk to her. Melissa had refused, and David had flown into a rage. He had followed her home, and the two had gotten into a heated argument that ended with David strangling Melissa to death. David was eventually charged with first-degree murder, and the trial was one of the most highly publicized in the town's history. The prosecution presented a compelling case, complete with eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence. David's defense team, however, argued that he was not in his right mind at the time of the murder. They presented evidence that he suffered from a severe mental illness, and that this illness had contributed to his violent behavior. The jury ultimately found David guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David's first few months in prison were a nightmare. He was constantly on edge, surrounded by violent criminals who saw him as an easy target. He was frequently beaten and robbed, and he lived in constant fear for his safety. But as time went on, David began to adapt to life in prison. He formed alliances with other inmates, and he learned how to defend himself. He became more aggressive, more confrontational, and more volatile. It wasn't long before David became one of the most feared inmates in the prison. He was known for his explosive temper, and he had a reputation for being willing to do anything to get what he wanted. Despite his reputation, David remained in contact with his family and friends on the outside. He wrote them letters and made phone calls, and he even managed to convince some of them to send him money and gifts. But as the years went by, David's behavior continued to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the other inmates were out to get him. He started to see threats and conspiracies around every corner, and he began to lash out at anyone who he perceived as a threat. One day, David got into a fight with another inmate over a small disagreement. The fight quickly turned violent, and David ended up seriously injuring the other inmate. He was placed in solitary confinement as punishment, and he remained there for several months. During his time in solitary, David's mental state continued to deteriorate. He became increasingly delusional, convinced that the guards were trying to kill him. He began to hear voices and see visions, and he became more and more disconnected from reality. When he was finally released from solitary, David was a changed man. He was more aggressive than ever before, and he seemed to have lost all touch with reality. He started to pick fights with anyone who crossed his path, and he became increasingly violent towards the guards and other staff members. Despite his behavior, David's family continued to support him. They visited him regularly, and they sent him money and gifts. But even they began to see that something was seriously wrong with David. One day, David's family received a letter from him that was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The letter was rambling, incoherent, and full of bizarre conspiracy theories. It was clear that David's mental state had deteriorated to a dangerous degree. David's family contacted the prison administration, begging them to get David the help he needed. But the prison was overcrowded and understaffed, and they simply did not have the resources to provide the kind of mental health care that David needed. As the months went by, David's behavior continued to spiral out of control. He became increasingly violent, and he started to lash out at anyone who came near him. He was placed in solitary confinement again and again, but it only seemed to make his behavior worse. Finally, one day, David snapped. He attacked a guard with a makeshift weapon, seriously injuring him. He was immediately placed in maximum security, and he was no longer allowed to have any contact with the outside world. For the next few years, David languished in maximum security. He was heavily medicated and closely monitored, but his mental state continued to deteriorate. He became increasingly isolated, and he lost touch with even his closest family members. In the end, David died alone in his cell, a broken and disturbed man.